You have to understand how insane this sounds. Imagine waking up tomorrow and deciding that from now on, you will only speak Latin. You go to the grocery store, but there is no word for credit card in Latin. You try to call a plumber, but you can't describe a leaking pipe because the Romans didn't have PVC. You try to tell your wife you love her, but the words feel stiff, ancient, like you're reading from a museum plaque. Everyone thinks you've lost your mind. Your neighbors mock you. Your family is worried. But you refuse to stop. You refuse to speak English ever again. Now, imagine doing this not just as a weird personal experiment, but with the goal of forcing an entire nation to join you. It sounds impossible. It sounds like a delusion. But in the late 19th century, one man actually did this. And because of his obsession, a language that had been functionally dead for 2,000 years, a language of silence and dust, is now the mother tongue of 9 million people. This is the story of the only successful resurrection of a dead language in human history. This is the story of Eliezer ben Yehuda. To really grasp the magnitude of this, we have to look at the Jewish world before the 20th century. For nearly 2 millennia, the Jewish people were the ultimate definition of a diaspora. They were everywhere: Poland, Yemen, Morocco, Spain, Russia. And because they were everywhere, they spoke the languages of everywhere. If you walked into a Jewish market in Warsaw, you heard Yiddish, a Germanic fusion. In the Balkans, you heard Ladino, a distinct Spanish dialect. In Baghdad, it was Judeo-Arabic. They were one people, bound by history and religion, but they were separated by a wall of sound. They literally could not talk to each other. Sure, they had Hebrew, but Hebrew was the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. It was frozen in amber. It was the language you used to pray to God, to study ancient legal texts, or to write formal, poetic letters to a scholar in another country. It was high, lofty, and sacred. You didn't use the holy tongue to haggle over the price of fish. You didn't use it to yell at your kids to clean their room. It had no texture for the mundane. It was a language of the soul, not the street. Enter Eliezer Perlman, born in 1858 inches, the Russian Empire. He was supposed to be just another scholar. He was a prodigy, raised in the flickering candlelight of yeshivas, memorizing ancient texts until his eyes burned. But outside those walls, Europe was on fire with nationalism. The Italians, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, they were all waking up, shaking off empires, and reclaiming their ancient identities. Perlman looked at them and saw a blueprint. He saw that a nation wasn't just land, it was a voice. He realized something that terrified the traditionalists. If the Jewish people were ever going to be a real nation again, they couldn't just pray together. They had to be able to argue, gossip, and flirt in their own language. He wrote a manifesto that would define his life. The Hebrew language can live only if we revive the nation and return it to the fatherland. It was a radical equation. Land plus language equals nation. He dropped his birth name, Perlman, and became Ben Yehuda, son of Judea. He wasn't just changing his name, he was changing his operating system. He moved to Paris, sat in cafes, and started forcing his friends to have stilted, awkward conversations in Hebrew. It was difficult. It was unnatural. But it was the proof of concept. In 1881, the theory hit the real world. Ben Yehuda and his new wife, Devorah, boarded a ship to Palestine. As the coast of Jaffa came into view, he turned to her and made a demand that borders on psychological warfare. He told her that from the moment their feet touched the sand, they would speak only Hebrew. Devorah barely knew the language. It didn't matter. This wasn't a preference, it was a law. They were going to be the first Hebrew-speaking family in 2,000 years, even if it meant total silence. When they arrived in Jerusalem, the reality set in. The city was a mosaic of tongues: Arabic, Turkish, Yiddish, Russian. By refusing to speak anything but Hebrew, Ben Yehuda made himself a social pariah. He couldn't just buy bread. He had to perform linguistic gymnastics to explain what he wanted. But he had a plan. He called it Hebrew in the home, Hebrew in the school, and words, words, words. The home front was the most brutal. When their first son, Ben Zion, later Itamar Ben Avi, was born in 1882, the experiment escalated. Ben Yehuda decided this child would be patient zero. The boy was to hear absolutely nothing but Hebrew. No lullabies in Russian, no Yiddish chatter from the neighbors. The house became a fortress. Ben Yehuda would physically block people from entering if he thought they might slip and say a word in a foreign tongue. He once caught Devorah singing a Russian song to the baby and exploded in rage. Imagine the tension in that house, the silence, the isolation. The neighbors whispered that Ben Yehuda was a monster. They said the child would grow up an idiot, that the isolation would break his mind. And for a long time, it looked like they were right. 3 years passed. 4 years. The boy didn't speak. The pressure was suffocating. Had Ben Yehuda sacrificed his own son on the altar of his ideology? Then, one day, in a moment of high emotion, the dam broke. The boy spoke, and he spoke Hebrew. It was the first time in nearly 2 millennia that a child had uttered his first words in the language of the Bible. It wasn't just a milestone, it was a miracle. But a language needs more than one child. It needs a vocabulary. And this was Ben Yehuda's second nightmare, the missing words. How do you live in the modern world with a Bronze Age vocabulary? You're sitting at your desk and you want to say newspaper. The word doesn't exist. You want to ride a bicycle? The word doesn't exist. You want to make an omelet? No word. So Ben Yehuda became a factory. He sat for 18 hours a day, surrounded by mountains of books, hunting for roots. He was an archaeologist of words. He'd dig up an obscure root from the Bible, twist it, add a modern suffix, and boom, a new word was born. He took the root for wheel and created Ophanaim. He took the concept of doll and coined buba. He invented glida for ice cream and iton for newspaper. He even had to invent the word for dictionary just so he could write one. He wasn't just documenting a language, he was engineering it in real time. He published these words in his newspaper, Hatzvi. This wasn't just news, it was a user manual for the new society. He was teaching people how to talk about the world, but not everyone was grateful. In fact, many people hated him. The ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem viewed him as a blasphemer. To them, Hebrew was God's private line. Using it to talk about sewage or politics was a sin. They declared Sherem excommunication on him. They threw stones at his house. They even snitched to the Ottoman authorities, claiming he was a rebel inciting sedition. Ben Yehuda was dragged to prison, locked up for a crime he didn't commit, all because he wanted to speak his ancestral tongue. And the tragedy wasn't just political, it was personal. The poverty was grinding, the stress was lethal. In 1891, his wife Devorah, the silent partner in this grueling experiment, died of tuberculosis. Shortly after, a diphtheria epidemic swept through Jerusalem. In the span of 10 days, Ben Yehuda buried 3 of his children. Any normal person would have broken. Any normal person would have said, "This price is too high." But Ben Yehuda wasn't normal. He was possessed. He married Devorah's sister, Hemda, and she, too, threw herself into the mission. The work didn't stop. It accelerated. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The craziness started to look like genius. A new wave of immigrants arrived, idealistic, secular Zionists who needed a common language to unite them. They looked at Ben Yehuda's crazy idea and realized it was the only practical solution. They adopted his words. They hired teachers who used his Hebrew in Hebrew method. Schools began to pop up where chemistry, math, and history were all taught in this revived tongue. The final boss battle for the language came in 1913, known as the War of the Languages. The German Jewish philanthropists funding the new Technion University in Haifa laid down the law. Science would be taught in German. Their logic was sound. German was the language of physics and engineering. Hebrew didn't even have technical terms for concrete or electricity. How could you build a bridge in Hebrew? Ben Yehuda and his allies went to war. They organized strikes. Teachers walked out of classrooms. Students protested in the streets. They argued that if the pinnacle of education, the university, was in German, Hebrew would remain a second-class peasant language forever. They refused to back down. And incredibly, they won. The board capitulated. The Technion would teach in Hebrew. It was the moment the language graduated from a kitchen experiment to a vehicle for high science and culture. By the time Eliezer ben Yehuda died in 1922, the impossible had become mundane. The British Mandate government officially recognized Hebrew as a state language. There were children running in the streets of Tel Aviv screaming at each other in Hebrew. There were poets writing in it, merchants selling in it, and lovers whispering in it. Ben Yehuda left behind a dictionary that grew to 17 volumes, a monument to his obsession. But his real monument wasn't on a shelf. It was on the lips of every person in the growing nation. Cecil Roth, a British historian, summed it up better than anyone else ever could. Before Ben Yehuda, Jews could speak Hebrew. After him, they did. Today, if you walk through the streets of Jerusalem, you hear a cacophony of life traffic, arguments, music, slang. It's loud, it's messy, and it's alive. And every single syllable of it is a testament to one man who sat in a room, looked at a dead language, and refused to let it die. It's a reminder that culture isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we choose, something we build, and sometimes something we have to fight for with everything we have.